We are very happy to welcome as our first speaker, Björn Wittrock, who is founding director of the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study and its principal in the years 1996 to 2018, and the vice president of Academia Europea. So thank you so much for joining us, and please go ahead.
Thank you so very much, Paulius. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank also Sadi, who is distant, and the staff who has helped me immensely. And of course, I'm so glad to look forward to very much to meet the other fellows. I will talk about an issue which I've been working on for some time and published on, but I will try to present the context of the paper that I shall hope to finalize during this month. Now, the social and human sciences in the form in which we know them today, that is, as university-based and professionally consolidated domains of knowledge, have, of course, a very long history stretching back hundreds of years, and I published a lot about that. But in this professionalized form in which we encounter them in contemporary universities, they really were shaped in a rather particular period of human history, namely in the decades around the former turn of the century. This period is exceptional in many respects. Never before nor later have the societies of Central and Western Europe occupied an equally dominant position in the global context. And this is valid both for political power, economic influence, share of global population, and in the production of knowledge and research. I mean, if you would have done a list of the 20 most important universities at that time, there would have been very few universities outside of Europe on that list. Now, this dominance came to be reflected in the premises and in the basic conceptual apparatuses of the social and human sciences. Since the last decade of the 20th century, this fact has been widely recognized. Yet, surprisingly few efforts have been made to systematically rethink these domains of scholarship from the vantage point of intellectual traditions and long-term historical trajectories of parts of the world outside of the North Atlantic area. But in the last few decades, there have been some prominent efforts in global history and in social science to challenge standard theories of modernization and to identify epochal shifts in the relative significance of different parts of the world, not least when it comes to comparisons of European and East Asian societies. This has involved efforts to understand the divergence of these societies in terms of their global significance from the 18th century onwards. Analogously, there have also been studies of the modern world as one characterized by the existence of multiple modernities, leading up to the present landscape of a number of broad constellations with different civilizational origins, partially collaborating, partially locked in contestation with each other. A starting point, however, must be critical re-examinations of theoretical imaginations that have come to exert an overpowering and often misdirected influence on historical social science and social theory. I intended originally to focus on two such imaginations, but given the time constraints, I will only focus on one. But I will come back in questions, probably comments to the other one as well. I shall do so in terms of constructing one particular genealogy in a strong sense of the word. Thus, the main protagonists in this genealogy during 3 periods of time since the beginning of the 20th century will be scholars who, first of all, should be aware of each other and refer to each other during each of these particular periods. Secondly, they should be aware of their predecessors at each stage. And thirdly, this awareness should be transitive. Thus, the contestation should give rise to continuous critical re-examination of its own premises. However, this only yields a kind of rough or even skeletal conception of the state of the issues that are at stake. a wider context must be brought in eventually, and I shall try to indicate how that can be done in my paper, and I've done it in different publications earlier, namely one that in particular should include scholars and intellectuals from areas outside of the Occident, and I can easily name a number of those who would be obvious and with whom I've collaborated in other earlier stages. Now, the idea I shall focus on is one of the critical ideas of one person who indisputably is one of the most cited social scientists ever, and who has exerted a strong, not always fortuitous, influence on the direction of the social sciences, namely Max Weber. And the idea I shall discuss is that of the axial age. And I shall look at that at three junctures that are crucial both in societal and in epistemic terms. So one pivotal time period for the efforts at reconsideration of the nature and pathways of human civilizations occurred in the decades around the former turn of the century. Another critical period of time occurs around the decades around the middle of the 20th century. And a third one should be the first 2 decades of the 21st, well, first 2.5 decades of the 21st century. Each of these periods of change have had as a background profound transformations in global patterns of appropriation, trade, and domination, but also of shifting culture and academic landscape. I shall highlight these shifts and contestations as they are reflected in the writings of a few prominent scholars during each of these transformative periods. Now, the half century before the First World War is an age in which the countries of Europe and North America undergo rapid change on an unprecedented scale. Their contacts with subtropical, tropical, but also subarctic areas of the globe change from being commercial and colonial into becoming increasingly intrusive and imperialist. It is in this area that some parts of social science become professionalized in terms of associations, academic institutionalizations, if on a limited scale, and go through a period in which basic conceptual categories are formulated that are later contested, but often sometimes also standardized. One important element in this process is the search for means to make sense of the other, of forms of life, of believing and doing outside the North Atlantic region. One focal point in intellectual debates in this period concerns the question whether religions other than Christianity should be addressed within theological faculties at European universities, and how such religions should be regarded more generally. In this discussion, different assumptions about the origin and historical trajectories of world religions had to be clarified, but also assumptions about the modern world more generally. Ernst Troeltsch and Max Weber were two important key contributors really to this debate. Now, in the middle of the 20th century, the societal and scholarly terms of this debate were radically reformulated. It is in this changing context that Karl Jasper's work on the origin and goal of history is published in 1949. In some ways, it represented a continuation relative to the works of Troeltsch and Weber. In other ways, it differed profoundly. I should then relate the continental European discussions about the axial age to the works and views of the leading sociologists and exponent to modernization theory in the American context, namely Tulker Parsons. I shall highlight the ways in which a natural link between continental European and American scholars about the study of world religion, civilizations, and the idea of the axial age failed to materialize in these years. I shall also analyze some features of current scholarly debates about world religions and civilizations against the background of ruptures in patterns of global economic power and hegemony, but also shifts in the intellectual landscape and ensuing conceptual contestations of a new type. I shall finally indicate some features of an emerging scholarly consensus on prerequisites for further efforts to articulate a way of writing a contextually sensitive history and sociology of periods of cultural crystallizations in world history. In epistemic terms, the early 20th century was a period in which the intellectual historian H.T. Hughes, in a now classical overview, Consciousness and Society, published in 1958, described it as one of the earlier period in which an earlier confidence in the universal applicability of a naturalistic and positivistic program to all domains of scholarship was waning, despite advances across a range of fields in the natural sciences. At the same time, a variety of programs for the incipient social sciences were competing with each other. I cannot go into details about Trelch. The time is not at all sufficient for that, but I would just mention that he was a leading figure in the so-called historical school of German theology, and a person who proposed and advocated that Christianity and other religions should be treated the object of research on an equal footing. He was also the first major German scholar to be invited to Britain after the First World War. In 1920, he gave a series, 5 lectures actually, in London, Oxford, and Edinburgh that took up some of these critical issues. They are published in a small book which is called the Historismus and its overcoming. These lectures, the first one delivered in Oxford on the position of Christianity among the world religions, is particularly fascinating. It contains a very strong plea not only for context and dialogue between representatives of different world religions, there is also a vision for the elaboration on a much deeper level of understanding of questions of human dignity as they appear from within given traditions, each with its own tacit presuppositions and its place within a certain cultural and societal context. What Trelch does is essentially to articulate a vision that the end results of such communicative interaction might be something much more significant than a vague generalization of values, something that, of course, was to occur when the UN drafted its first agenda of human rights. However, in contrast to Trelch, Weber came to develop a program for the comparative study of world religions, but also of the cultural worlds, that is, the civilizations in which these religions formed a significant part, at least in genealogical terms. The most extensive scholarly work, which was prepared for publication by Weber himself, are the 3 volumes of more than 1,400 pages of text of the collected essays on the sociology of religion that came out in 1920-21, shortly after Weber's death. While the point of departure for Weber's project is the objective to formulate and examine an argument about the causes of a specific form of capitalism in the modern world, a major share of the pages of the 3 volumes have a focus on the transformations that occurred in the period which many historians of world religions have come to label the Axial Age. This is true. I can go into detail, but I won't. But it is a fascinating book, and it is the most significant book that Weber himself edited, actually, before his death. The most famous book of Weber, apart from this, is probably the one on economy and society, Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft. But for English speakers, it's perhaps noteworthy that the first really correctly edited and very carefully edited volume of this was published as late as 2019. It is an edition published by Harvard University Press and edited and translated by Keith Tribe, who spent 2 long periods, among other institutions, at our institute in Uppsala. Now, Weber's study of the great world religions is also a global history that presents an overview of the state of the art of knowledge as it looked in the early 20th century about the long-term history of different civilizations. Its basic premise of being a synthetic work affects not only Weber's assessment of the situation at the turn of the 20th century, when Europe's leading position in science, economic innovations, and sheer political dominance was undeniable. It also exerts an influence on the account of the long-term history of different civilizations. It is a fascinating book, and I will only make 3 remarks on it here, which indicates its problematic character. So firstly, of course, it has a focus on the emergence of, I mean, its alleged focus is sort of the prehistory of the emergence of a modern capitalist economy, a modern rational bureaucracy, and modern science. And the conclusions, I mean, really do not, I mean, I don't think he really achieves this objective. It comes closest possibly in the second volume on Hinduism and Buddhism, where he has a very interesting historical scientific argumentation about the conditions for the emergence of a separation between aesthetics forms of expressiveness and those that emerge out of laboratory settings. But otherwise, it is in reality a kind of global history with an alleged focus. I can comment on this much more afterwards, but in large parts, it is, when you read the volumes, this broad global history of world civilization, you are very much reminded of the works of Brodel. I mean, like Brodel, he sometimes even starts with outlining the geographic contours of different societies. But I'll come back to it. But it's a major work, but it's also a deeply problematic work. And secondly, one reason why it's problematic is, of course, that Weber never really defines the concept of rationality, which is a crucial one in this. You really have to make a contextual reading to be able to articulate his different notions of rationality. So these multifarious denotations of the entities to which he ascribes the property of being rational are not only many, but there are categorically different types. So they can refer to actions, they can refer to strings of actions, practices, they can refer to human beings and their actions, they can refer to dispositions among human beings. So one key disposition is that of having a particular form of conduct of life, particular Lebensführung. But that means that you are disposed under certain conditions to behave a certain way and not behave in another way. But we all know the hugely complicated philosophical implications in terms of counterfactuals of working with dispositions. But there are multifarious meanings. But there is one third, even more significant feature that has to be taken into account. And that is that Weber sometimes bundles together different practices and call them a social sphere. And in something called the intermediate observation, Zwischenbetrachtung, which is a huge analytical chapter, one of his most ambitious, and it occurs at the end of the first volume of these collected essays. He tries to discern 5 such social spheres. And within each sphere, a so-called process of rationalization may occur, and that may not at all be relevant to our imaginations of rationality as expressing a form of calculation and a careful consideration of the means appropriate for the attainment of a particular objective. It means in this context the radicalization of an inner logic inherent in these different spheres. And the different spheres that he analyzed in this particular part is politics and administration, it's economics, but it's also aesthetics and erotics. And then the fifth one by such a meta status is that of knowledge and science. And not surprisingly, the analysis points to a number of points of not only confluence, but contestation between these different spheres. So it's a hugely complicated essay, but analytically doing work that is perhaps more ambitious than anything he ever did. Hans Joas has, in the first volume, he was currently prepared trilogy, the book that is called The Power of the Sacred, analyzed this, and he argues that in the end it's a failure, you have to give up. I think he is exaggerating that claim a bit, and I think he also you could have made provide a rather clear rationalization of Weber's choice of these different social spheres, but I cannot elaborate this more. It's a fascinating and almost hymn-like form of expressiveness where you sort of sentence after sentence of more than 100 words roll in on you with a very particular vocabulary of Weber. But these are some of the key problems. Anyway, it is a work that has inspired many other scholars, not least one of the leading anti-Nazi German scholars, namely Karl Jaspers, who in 1949 produced a book which is called The Origins and Goal of History, where he takes up these ideas of Weber and tries to formulate them in a succinct form. And he calls the period in the middle of the first millennium BCE, with the emergence of the great world religions, with the emergence of forms of thought that are transcending just mythical thinking and provides analytical narratives of transformative processes in different world religions, not least in China, in India, in the prophetic age of Judaism, and in classical Greek philosophy, and for that matter also in Iran in the same period. He calls this the axial age, and this idea has been taken up by an increasing number of philosophers and authors in recent years. Now, I would like to say a few words about Parsons and the discussion in the United States around the middle of the century, 20th century, because Parsons, of course, saw himself as the great interpreter of Weber, and he also translated some of the key texts. But he does that in a very particular way. So if you read Parsons, for instance, translation of the famous prefacial remark at the beginning of the 3 volumes of the essay on the collected essays on the sociology of religion, you will come up with something that is very far from the vocabulary of Weber himself. In Weber's text is always characterized by sort of ironic form, where he also modifies the claims he advances, puts in doubts about the validity of those claims. Nothing of that is apparent in Parsons' vocabulary, where all of these subjunctive phrases are turned into indicative phrases, which makes Weber much more flat and a simply more simplistic advocate of processes of modernization than he was in fact. Parsons, of course, exerted enormous influence, not only in terms of his own writings, but in terms of the creation in 1946 of the Department of Social Relations at Harvard, comprising both anthropology, psychology, and sociology, and bringing out generation after generation of scholars that were to be very eminent. In the 1960s, when Parsons' sociology no longer was being challenged for a number of reasons, he tried to insert a more historical notion in his theorizing. In the spring semester of 1963, Parsons and 2 younger colleagues, Robert Bella and Eisenstadt, gave a series of seminars at Harvard on evolution. And one result of this was Parsons' book on society's evolution and comparative perspectives in 1966, which was aimed at demonstrating that Parsons' theorizing could encompass a lot of the critique that had been leveled against it. I think he doesn't succeed in this, but in reality, it is a rather crude rewriting of some of the theses that you find in Weber and in Jaspers. And it is a slender book with the title of Society's Comparative and Historical Perspectives. This line of argumentation was later taken up by the person who was called Parsons' favorite disciple, namely Robert Bella, and his most monumental work appeared in the beginning of this century. It is called Religion and Human Evolution from the Paleolithic to the Axial Age. It was followed 2 years later by a book edited by him and Hans Joas, which is called After the Axial Age and Its Consequences in 2012, to which I've also contributed. Parsons' Bella's argumentation is thoroughly evolutionary. It's not thoroughly, but it's deeply influenced by evolutionary thinking. But it's a learned and very significant piece of research. One other major scholar who worked parallel to Bella was Shmuel Eisenstadt. And I worked for about 25 years very closely with him on his elaboration of some of these themes, which were very different from Parsons and rather much more influenced by by Jaspers and a dialogical, or you could even say dialectical reasoning, and very much focused on worlds, on cultural worlds, or what used to be called the regions of what used to be called the third world. I cannot go into this now because I'm also writing and made sort of an outline of an intellectual biography of Eisenstadt. Let me just mention, I mentioned Hans Joas's work, but I will not go into it. I've written a lot about it in other contexts, but let me just mention that in Jürgen Habermas' late magnum opus, it's called This Also a History of Philosophy, which came out in 2019 in German, and the first edition or the first volume of this work came out, published by Polity Press in Cambridge last autumn. And the book is called, then, as I said, This Also a History of Philosophy, and it aims at exploring the intellectual trajectories that could give rise to what Habermas calls vernünftige Freiheit, sort of a constellation of liberty and reason. And it's an enormously ambitious work. Habermas explicitly argues that it was first with Eisenstadt and his comparative work with a lot of scholars involved, in which I was also involved, that you got a firm empirical basis for a serious discussion of these matters. Habermas' work refers to the idea of the actual age, page up and page down, but what it does is essentially to create a genealogy in which scholars such as Ludwig Feuerbach, Karl Marx, Søren Kierkegaard, but also American pragmatism, are sources of significant participants in an exploration of the possibilities to formulate a post-metaphysical idea of reason and liberty. To my mind, this is one of the most important works in political philosophy in recent years, and I could discuss it in other contexts. Let me just end, if you allow me 5 more minutes, by saying that any discussion about the modern world and our own situation must, I think, have recognized 3 features, namely that much of this reasoning on modernities has been badly lacking in looking at the early histories of modernities. I published, together with Eisenstadt and the Bavarian German scholar Wolfgang Schluchter, a special issue of the journal Daedalus of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences on early modernities, when we went back all the way to the 10th and 11th centuries and involved scholars from other parts of the world in the Atlantic region. Now, I would also argue that we also published a book on multiple modernities, a highly contested concept 2 years later. But such an account of the modern world cannot just be an account of institutional transformations, as Parsons, for instance, did when he spoke solely of the Industrial Revolution, the political revolutions, and the educational revolution. I think that simply doesn't work. Instead, we must understand that deep-seated and often revolutionary social change is related to epistemic changes, and that those epistemic concepts are often of a promissory nature. They don't directly translate into actions or to institutional transformations, but sometimes, and often with delays, they may do so. And I think we by now have a relatively clear understanding of the conditions when this may occur. Well, I've written about that in other contexts. Now, if I have 1 or 2 minutes, I would say, when writing about the contemporary world, and that is what I will try to do during this month, we have to recognize some important things. So concerning historicity, which is a key concept in all reasoning on the actual age, but also in all reasoning about modernity up to now, historicity, we must recognize that there is a certain disappearance of any idea of linear time. And that also means that concepts such as progressive will take on a completely different meaning. So the waning of linear time will have deep implications for how we construct historicity. Secondly, there is a kind of bifurcation, it's a kind of epistemological bifurcation that deeply affects all of the social and human sciences. And that has to do with, we have on the one hand, what I would call the néo-naturalisme, scientism, that is reflected, for instance, in the role of the cognitive sciences and neurosciences, in the role in which earth sciences play a key role, in the way in which we think of climatology and natural processes as absolutely crucial for an understanding of the transformation of our contemporary world. But this neo-naturalistic reasoning will also mean that an understanding of human agentiality will profoundly change. In the sort of classical age of the formation of the modern world, that was characterized by very exaggerated forms of voluntarism and imaginations of the agential possibilities of human beings. So how can we construct a notion of human agency that encompasses insights from the natural sciences, but is not solely subjugated to those, but is able to formulate a notion of agentiality on its own? And finally, conceptions of sociality were always inherent in conceptions of the modern world. So different imaginations of sociality, when we replace ideas of the ruler and her, his subjects, and replace them with ideas of citizenship, that means a profound changing of sociality. But what is the sociality we can work with in the contemporary age when we have sort of exaggerated notions of ethnic nationalism, very intense forms of those kinds of collective identities, and then some often very vague ideas of globalism? And when we also face the problems of cosmologies, the tendency to work with the transposition of omniscience, not locate them in a collective entity such a political party, but rather put them in a not very clearly described entity. What is the notion of omniscience? What is the notion of omnipotence in such a setting? What is the idea of a non-terrestrial other? How can this infatuation with exoplanets and non-terrestrial others allow us to making a social science and a social theory that takes our living in this world seriously enough? So all the critiques inherent in Habermas' account, all the theoretical and historical reasoning with Weber, Eisenstadt, and others must inform us to some extent. We must also be very careful of reductive reasoning, which is inherent in some of those accounts, and we must find at least a modicum of real far extensive sociality that helps us to do much better than we do in the present case, when we just look very briefly across the world with all the tragedies that occur in front of our eyes at the moment. I apologize deeply for the length of this, but I had prepared for a somewhat longer lecture than I was supposed to give. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Wittrock. We have a few minutes for questions. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, Sally.
Björn, thank you so much. I mean, this is a fascinating endeavor on the global history of thought that you're giving us to understand this parallel transformation of societies and how they're thought and understood in sort of an epistemic relationship. And actually, to give context to my question, I mean, this resonates with an empirical finding in the research we're currently doing with Helga Novotny on the transformation of the current system, that economics, as we discover, is not a general science of what humans do with resources, but rather a theory of a specific Western system, modern capitalist economy, and the initiatives that we're studying do not fit in these economic frameworks which were constructed in another time and system. Their transactions involve non-economic values, etc. So there's a mismatch, between our theory of the world and what it is. And you point that there is a chicken and egg relationship between what society is and how it's thought. And your talk highlighted, I think, the impact of the societal context and the zeitgeist on the theories, right? And so my question is to you, as someone who has, as a main actor, not only a thorough vision of the current state of thought, but also of academia and its connection with the larger societal system. So in your perspective, what is for us the role that scientists and intellectuals should have in this reflexivity exercise on society? I mean, how can we affect history? How do thinkers like Weber or Chakrabarty can affect history, and what should we do in practice? If we want to go beyond this neo-naturalism that you're talking about, what would be your advice as a core pillar of the academic system, I would say? How should we do it? Because there's urgency, as you said.
Yes. I will answer in 3 steps. So the first step is, let me just mention that the other genealogy that I thought was in a sense too simple, but I had intended to take up, was the one that you can read when you start reading Weber's Economy of Society. And there he is more blunt, and I think less interesting than he is in the Collective Essays on Sociology and Religion. I mean, he just says that a modern capitalist enterprise has just appeared in the West. I think it was empirically wrong already at the time when he wrote it. And then he has a theory of its emergence, and he locates that to the 11th and 12th centuries, with these 3 revolutions of the papal revolution and the battle around investiture, the so-called feudal revolution, when you have new rules for inheritance and property rights, and when you also have an urban revolution, sort of a density of urban populations that are somehow lifted out of feudal connections. And the upshot of what all, I mean, Weber didn't formulate it so crudely, but this master narrative is the dominant, I would say, master narrative in the social sciences, even today. You could take an economic historian, Nobel laureate, such as Douglas North, and he has it. Or you could take really a medical scholar such as Jerry Diamond in his long stories. They will immediately tell you why China failed and why Europe with its pluralism succeeded. But of course, from a Chinese perspective, the European story of sort of century after century of bloody civil wars about why we have a certain religion is just incomprehensible. And in the process of that, we also lose our common language, Latin. From a Chinese perspective, this is a catastrophic development. And this example of an emperor in the 1440s prohibiting transoceanic voyages, I think that is not a very satisfactory solution. So what I and some other colleagues of mine have done is try to construct analytical categories that allow us to talk about these changes in the 10th to 12th centuries in ways that are not completely Eurocentric. But this master narrative that Weber sketched has in vulgarized form informed us even today. And I think I didn't want to do that, but I could have quoted people who have been military advisors in the US. I don't think these catastrophic events in the Middle East would have occurred. They may have occurred anyway, but I mean, they are intellectually underpinned by a sort of a simplified version of this master narrative. So that's very dangerous. My second answer would be, the economist, you're absolutely right about the economist. And of course, even in economics, a naturalistic reasoning is creeping in. So when I know that people were deliberating giving the prize to somebody doing neuroeconomics the other year. But I mean, the moment we have sort of replaced, and it's nothing wrong with working with the neurosciences, but you cannot decouple human agency and human reflection from that, because then it will be shortcut. And you are absolutely wrong that the economists, I don't think they can, and they are much more humble. And when they are humble, they tend to give, or we actually tend to give the prize to better people than otherwise. But there is another epistemic problem that I didn't refer to, and that is that, I've been chair for a couple of years of the jury for the social science humanities of the Falling Walls Award, this effort to construct a kind of, not Davos meeting of the enterprises, but an intellectual kind of summit meeting, and give a premium to people who have broken the mold in the social science. Last year, we gave the prize to somebody called Pumla Dane Gkola, and she is a literary scholar of sorts, but she's also an activist in South Africa, and written these books about rape in South Africa, and the Fear Factory. Very, very interesting and extremely intelligent person, I think. So, but there is sort of an epistemic blurring of the boundaries of genres to an extent that wasn't the case before. So you can meet scholars who want one on the same time invoke natural sciences, and at the same time are activists or journalists or engage in artistic expressive activities. All of that is good, but I think it forces us to reflect very much on our own heritage. So what you are doing with Helga, I think, is extremely important. And we cannot, I mean, if you're a practicing scholar in the humanities or sciences, you go on and do your business. But I think there was, in the second half of the 20th century, a real hope that once we have gotten rid of the simplistic versions of structural functionalism, we would be able to construct a social science that took structural properties seriously, brought in an element of agency, and we would understand world transformation. So, I mean, both Tony Giddens with the structuration theory, Bourdieu with his habitus, Margaret Archer with her morphogenesis, or Piotr Stomka with the theory of social becoming, all of them, or us, we thought that we were on the verge of really beginning to understand the world in an informed way. And I see very little of that now. So I think we are at a very critical point. So what you and Helga are doing, please tell me more about it later, I've heard a little bit from Helga, is probably an enormously important exercise. But it must involve, I think, a critical rethinking of our own traditions and formulation of sort of goals that are not over-ambitious, but are achievable. I mean, some kind of cosmology that doesn't start us believing that aliens will bring us omniscience and omnibenevolence and so forth, and some form of sociality that recognizes the global character of relationships, and it's not just human rights, but gives us a form of empathy that is much more extensive than that, than hated forms of ethno-nationalism can do. Well, this was a sermon rather than a good, but I think this is the context in which you are searching for a solution, and I hope to, if I can contribute in the least to that, I would happily do so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, I am sorry we are out of time for more questions, but I encourage you to keep discussing with Professor Wittrock during this month. If you have any additional questions or comments, I would invite you to write it in the chat as well, please. And thank you so much, Professor Wittrock, for joining us today.
Thank you. It's an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.